Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Amid the recent rise of antisemitism and the unease that brings, we are marking the month of May as Jewish American Heritage Month. This is a time when so many of us in the Jewish community are feeling misunderstood, unwelcome, and confronting hatred. But the American Jewish experience is so much more than standing up to hatred and bigotry. Over the past 370 years, Jewish Americans have served in government, the military, they've won Nobel Prizes, headed universities and corporations, advanced medicine, the arts, and justice. Here to celebrate Jewish American heritage is AJC CEO Ted Deutch. Ted, welcome back to People of the Pod.
Thank you very much.
Ted, you began serving in Congress in 2010, a few years after Jewish American Heritage Month was first proclaimed in 2006. Can you tell us a little bit of the history behind Jewish American Heritage, or what we like to call JAM?
Well, the Jewish American Heritage Month has been around for almost 20 years. Congress passed a resolution that was led by my former colleague, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to acknowledge the important contributions that Jewish Americans have made throughout our history. And in 2006, President George W. Bush designated the month of May to be Jewish American Heritage Month. And there have been presidential proclamations every year since. This year, President Biden proclaimed May to be Jewish American Heritage Month and outlined the history of the American Jewish community and the fact that Jewish American culture is so inextricably woven into the fabric of our country. And we have to spend time thinking about that, particularly at a moment when so many are really taking positions and saying things that challenge our contributions that are made and that really put so many of us in the Jewish community on edge, make us feel at risk. This is an important opportunity to really stand proudly as Jewish Americans.
You know, during the month of March, Women's History Month, I always discover a new role model, a particularly amazing woman that I never knew existed. And the same is often true during Jewish American Heritage Month, but in reverse. I discover that people whom I always thought to be amazing and heroes in my book are Jewish. Did you have heroes growing up who you discovered were, or maybe you already knew, were Jewish?
It's interesting. Our community is, I think, always looking to elevate those from our community who make a meaningful impact in society. I remember when I learned about Eddie Jacobson, that was one of those moments for me. Eddie Jacobson was a friend, a business partner of Harry Truman. And during the war, when he was focused on the plight of the Jews in Europe, his friendship led him to go advocate with then Senator Truman to urge the U.S. to do more for the Jews who were being discriminated against, harassed, ultimately those who were being sent to concentration camps. That was a relationship that he had and was able to use to help strengthen his own community. And what he did that was, I think, even more important than that was following the war, when he understood that there was this opportunity for the rebirth of the modern state of Israel, he went to urge his friend, then President Truman, to meet with Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement. And President Truman was reluctant, but because of that relationship, that personal relationship, Eddie Jacobson was able to convince the president to take that meeting, which then ultimately led to the recognition of the state of Israel by the United States just minutes after Israel declared its independence, being the first country to recognize Israel. He's a hero in the history of the Jewish people. He played a really important role, I think, in the history of the country. I think most people had no idea or may never have heard of him. There are also the heroes from within the Jewish community that in Jewish American Heritage Month, we have the chance to think about people who impacted us, impacted the way we work to strengthen the Jewish community, who maybe aren't famous at all. I think about the Jewish leaders that I was privileged to know when I was a college student, and our Hillel director, Michael Brooks, and the professors who helped guide us were at a moment years ago when we were facing anti-Semitism. The student newspaper ran this series of outrageously anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic editorials, unfortunately sounding familiar. The support from these heroic adults, for those of us who were students, to go out and to hold rallies and to protest outside of the student newspaper and to make sure that people understood what the facts were, that kind of heroism really resonates because it's a reminder of what we can do for young people now at a moment when they're looking to others in the community to help support them. It really carries right through to the work that I get to do every day that I'm so privileged to do, and really the ways that all of us can work behind the scenes to help lift up the voices of Jewish young people today.
It's interesting that you bring up who the heroes were for yourself when you were younger. I'm sure you've been to baseball games, Yankees, Cubs, Mighty Muscles, whoever your team might be.
Mighty what?
The Mighty Muscles. They're right there in Fort Myers, Florida. It's also the name of my son's baseball team. They're named after minor league teams. But I'm sure you've been to these games where the announcer asks the heroes to stand, be recognized by the crowd. And everyone knows that the announcer is calling on veterans, right? Members of the military, first responders. And they are undoubtedly heroes. But in those moments, I often wish they would list all the many types of heroes when they do that. The doctors, the nurses, the teachers, God bless them. How do you define hero?
Well, you're exactly right in what those moments feel like. And first of all, I think it's important that we acknowledge in Jewish American Heritage Month the contributions of Jewish Americans throughout our nation's history in defending our country. We've talked before, I talk a lot about my father, who graduated from high school and enlisted in the Army to go fight the Nazis and earned a Purple Heart in the Battle of the Bulge. And all of the people like him who, whether it was in World War II or Korea or Vietnam, right on through the wars in the Middle East, wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the contributions from Jewish Americans who were proudly Jewish as they served our country, those are really important to remember. And every time at a sporting event where they ask the heroes to rise, I think it's important to think about that. You know, down here in South Florida, when they do that at sporting events, it's not unusual, especially if they're recognizing someone from World War II or the conflict in Korea in particular. It's just not that unusual for the veterans to be Jewish Americans. And there's always an extra amount of pride that you feel when they make those announcements. I do think it's important to think about all that we've contributed in defense of the country. But you're right. There are so many people who are heroes who serve our country in other ways. We had a moment during COVID where I think everybody recognized the heroism of our first responders, of our doctors and nurses, and people who went in when COVID was raging and people knew so very little about it. And every day they went to work to take care of people and help save lives. And there was that moment. And I think it's important that we have more moments like that. It's true for police officers and firefighters and first responders. Again, too often, I think we sort of take for granted the work that so many people do, putting themselves out in service of others. And you mentioned teachers. There's just no question that the contributions of teachers, and so many Jewish teachers among them, who have committed their lives to helping prepare the next generation, to help them become citizens in our country and understand our history and learn what they need to be able to thrive in our society and in their lives. They're doing an incredible service and should be recognized as well. And so when we think about Jewish American Heritage Month, look, I'm all for thinking about getting back to athletes. I'm all for thinking about Alex Bregman from the Astros. And for those of us who are hockey fans, it's sort of the glory days for Jews in hockey, and Zach Hyman and the Hughes and others. But it's the people that we've not heard of, whose names we don't know, who come from our own families, that we need to hold up and think about as the real heroes for the work they do every day in their lives.
It has been 7 months now since terrorists attacked Israel on October 7th. And I'm curious if, in your opinion, the last 7 months have changed what it means to be a hero, especially in the Jewish world.
Well, there are all kinds of people in the Jewish world right now who are doing heroic work since 10/7 in ways that either weren't necessary or were unappreciated before 10/7 because the challenges are so much greater. We were just talking about people who serve the country. IDF soldiers are heroes. And what the IDF has done since 10/7 to defend Israel in the face of the horrific attacks by Hamas is heroic, and the loss of life is painful. And so even as we mourn those soldiers who have been killed, we have to take a moment to appreciate the heroism. But there are others, the hostage families who travel to New York and Washington and around the world. And we at AJC are so privileged to work with so many of them to help give them voice and make sure that they're heard. But as they struggle now for more than 200 days that their loved ones have been held captive deep below Gaza, they continue to go out and advocate for the release of their loved ones and to help people understand that these are real people and we feel like we've gotten to know them. And that's because of the heroic actions that their loved ones have taken. There are people on social media who have become heroes for every day just going to battle against the lies and misinformation on so many of the social media outlets. In the United States, on college campuses right now, what we've seen from so many students, whether they're on our campus global board, high school students from our LIFT program, but wherever they are, the ability for students to stand up and to say, in the face of these protests that are often directed at the Jewish community, the language is horrific and it is dangerous and unacceptable. And in the face of all of that, the number of students and young people who are standing up saying, I am a proud Jew who loves Israel, and I'm going to fight back in all of the ways I can to make sure that people know who we are, to make sure that they understand the truth of what's happening now. There are so many young people now who are doing heroic things and will continue to do heroic things, I have no doubt, for the rest of their lives. And I think it's important to stop to acknowledge that. I know these days it's not popular to talk about heroes in politics, but if you pause for a moment and think about what Richie Torres has done as a member of Congress, a progressive member of Congress, standing firmly in support of Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and speaking with a moral clarity that we wish others could follow. Richie's a hero. John Fetterman staring down the protesters day after day the way that he does is a hero. At a time when there is so little bipartisanship, the fact that Speaker Johnson decided to move forward with the aid package for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan with humanitarian aid and got that done, we should be celebrating his contributions. There are a lot of people that we really need to stop and be grateful for. And obviously, they're not all Jews, but it's a moment when the Jewish community, as we're thinking about our own heroes, should pause to be grateful for those who have really been helpful to the community.
Now, you've just mentioned a lot of the people who've had a high profile since October 7th. Any ordinary or overlooked heroes that we might not think to recognize?
Being a parent of a Jewish child shouldn't be heroic. And yet, seeing parents find more ways for their kids to really understand who we are as a community, find more ways for them to be involved, find more ways for them to learn, especially after 10/7, really teaching more and more about who we are as Jews to our kids, that's heroic. I don't think it should be heroic to be a rabbi or a Hebrew school teacher or someone who works at a day school or in the Jewish community. But in this post-10/7 world, that work in so many instances is heroic because of all of the baggage that comes with the protesters, with the challenges to the community, with the things that we see on social media. To get up every single day and to be there as leaders in the Jewish community, in synagogues, in schools, in the organizational world, as we prepare to get ready for camp season. All of these Jewish professionals are doing heroic work, and the community is so much better and stronger for it and for them.
How did October 7th change you and your approach to either public service or service to the Jewish people?
First, there's an urgency with which I try to meet every single day since 10/7. I think it's something that we all feel. I think a lot about the way that we felt on 10/7 that morning when we were learning about what happened, and the fragility of Israel, and the notion that the Jewish community and Israel are so inextricably linked became more powerful than ever, and that both felt at risk that day and the days after. It's just required a constant and urgent focus on trying to make sure that people understand what's actually happening, putting out meaningful and factual information, and pushing back against false narratives, something that we've tried so hard to do literally since 10/7, helping people understand that the protests didn't start when IDF soldiers marched into Gaza to defend Israel and the Jewish people. They started after Hamas slaughtered 1,200 people on October 7th. These were protests in support of this vile terrorism, and helping people understand that when Iran launched close to 350 missiles and drones, it was part of an ongoing effort through Iran, with Iran at the head, but that includes Hamas and Hezbollah and the militia in Iraq and the militia in Syria and the Houthis and others throughout the region, all to target Israel. Again, urgently making that clear every single day. So there's an urgency, there is a passion to make sure that the commitment in the community, the way that people have stood up and said, you know what, there are a lot of things that are important, but man, our community needs us to focus on ourselves, that ultimately the only people that we know that we can count on are the Jewish people. And yes, we're going to continue to work with our friends and allies and partners. That's important. But working hard to retain the sense of unity within the Jewish community is also something that was never really a priority. But now that we've seen what that unity looks like and what it means when we all stand together in the face of this Hamas evil, in the face of these protesters celebrating terrorism and calling for the destruction of Israel, that's a unity that we have to desperately try to hold on to and to bring people together around, not just while this war is going on, but on into the future.
Ted, thank you so much for joining us.
I hope people will use this as an opportunity to share their own stories, their family stories, the stories of the people that they know deserve some attention for what they've done to strengthen America. And I hope that they'll go out and they'll tell the story and they'll get others to listen. Our contributions to America have been so rich and varied and instrumental to the kind of country that we have and the kind of country that we know we need to continue to be. These are stories that everyone needs to hear. So I very much appreciate the opportunity.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with Noah Fay, a student leader at Columbia University, where the anti-Israel protest movement has taken over the college campus, leading Columbia administrators to shut down in-person learning and cancel commencement ceremonies. Noah shares her firsthand perspective on what it's like to be Jewish on campus at this moment in history. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.